Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Glad to see everyone here, and I hope we have a reasonable presence online as well. So welcome to people who are listening in. This is, as I assume most people know, this is the Adaptation Community Meeting sponsored by USAID. As probably most people know, this is a monthly event, generally the third Thursday of each month. And the topics are related to adaptation, but cover a wide range of activities in different technical sectors, different approaches to things, whatever. But generally they do focus on USAID work, or at least USAID work in part, and possibly other work as well. So we encourage people to continue to come, and if you have ideas for future events, we're all ears on that as well. Let's see. So in a minute, I'm going to introduce our moderator, but before I do that, just a couple other housekeeping notes. If you don't get the regular notifications about these events and other things related to USAID climate adaptation and climate mitigation work, I would encourage you to sign up on climatelinks.org. That's an outward-facing USAID-sponsored website for all things climate in the agency. And if you do that, you'll get notifications about these ACMs, plus all kinds of other great things that are going on in the adaptation world. So, oh, and one last thing. For those listening online, if you would please mute your microphones so we don't get any background noise during the presentations. And then, yeah, that's it. Don't ever unmute them, right? Okay, don't ever unmute them. If you have questions, type them in. Last thing, just to give a preview of next month, on May 16th, which is the third Thursday of next month, we have a really interesting discussion of the links between climate and malaria. This is sort of a major milestone on work that Atlas has been doing with the Africa Bureau for 4 years now. And this presentation will be on a major report that is going to be released, hopefully, in advance of that session next month that focuses on, as I say, the links between climate and malaria and in Africa, and has all kinds of interesting data associated therewith. So I would encourage everyone to also either come or tune in for that one, and keep your eye out for the report as well. Okay, that's it. So without further ado, I will turn things over to our moderator, Ali McAlady. Ali?
Very much. Yeah, sure. Thanks very much. And thanks for being here. I'm Ali McAlady. I work at USAID's Water Office, part of the E3 Bureau, and I'm currently the activity manager for the Sustainable Water Partnership, which you'll hear more about in a little while. I wanted to, I thought I would introduce the discussion today by setting some context about changes in USAID policy around water resources management and water. So like I said, I sit in the Office of Water, and our core kind of mandate is around providing sustainable access to drinking water and sanitation services. And in the last year and a half, we, together with the interagency, have updated our policies, both for USAID and for the interagency. And those policies, the Global Water Strategy and the USAID Water and Development Plan, they kind of set out our direction for work in this area over the next 5 years. And two key differences in the approaches that we're considering, or that we're going to follow, is the elevation of our work around water and sanitation governance and finance, and also the importance of improving water resources management to reaching our goals. So those shifts are really in response to growing recognition that physical water scarcity over abstraction of groundwater, water pollution, and conflict over water resources is undermining the provision of safe drinking water and sanitation infrastructure. Already, 1.2 billion people live in areas of physical water scarcity, and if trends in the demand and in climate extremes persist, nearly 2/3 of the world's population could be living in areas that are under severe water stress. in the next decade, and that's according to the World Bank. So these challenges, they threaten and they undermine our drinking water and sanitation services, and they also threaten food security and economic growth and natural ecosystems. And so it sort of necessitates more of a multi-sectoral approach to water resources management, and I think that's the direction we're headed in. So that's just to say that there's growing recognition in USAID around the importance of water resources management and water governance more generally to address climate and other risks to drinking water, agriculture, and health. So with that, I think it's great that we're going to hear from some USAID activities that will really exemplify the agency's work to reduce climate-related risks to water supplies and to better manage water resources in the context of climate variability and change. In terms of the run of show, we're first going to have three presentations, and then we're going to hold all of our questions till the end, where we'll moderate a discussion. For the remainder of the time, we should have a good long bit for discussion. First, we're going to hear from the Resilient Waters activity, and I'd like to introduce Brian App, and I think I'll just hand it over to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Okay, so I'm going to speak about the USAID Southern Africa Resilient Waters Program. Now, this is a 5-year, $32 million program. I'm not going to read too much here, but let me get this one right. The overarching goal is to build more resilient and water-secure Southern African communities and ecosystems through improved management of transboundary natural resources and increased access to safe drinking water and sanitation services. Okay, so it's this pretty new project. Okay, so that I'm going to present a bit on how the project came to be, and with some of the predecessor projects. It's actually the latest in a series of interventions that USAID Southern Africa has had. And I want to say that while we do water is not a water project per se. What water is sort of the unifying theme around which we organize the various elements. Okay, so what's the context of the project? There's a lot of challenges, obviously. Big one is population. Okay, the population in the region is supposed to double by 2050. And then we have climate change, where we're looking at rising temperatures, decreasing, and more variable rainfall, more frequent and intense weather events. So working these two together really act on each other to make the project, the problems much harder to deal with. And on the water side, basically these mean we are facing increased demand as we have more people and more urban people, and decreased availability, having some more variability in flows, higher evapotranspiration, etc. So more people, fewer resources. Not an unfamiliar story, but it's pretty clear in Southern Africa. So where did this program come from? I think USAID, and let's just look back at the 90s, was programming a lot of community-based natural resource management programs. You probably know maybe Campfire program in Zimbabwe, the LIFE programs in Namibia, the Natural Resource Management Program in Botswana. There was a focus on communities and how they could contribute to environmental management, and that would flow up to some of the regional impacts that we're looking for. But from the 2000s, I think USAID took it to a different phase, and a lot of those CBNRM programs are still working and are still operating, especially I think in Namibia. But the new focus was looking at it from the regional side, working with SADC and the river basin organizations. There's a protocol under SADC, that Shared Watercourse Protocol, where there's a commission set up for any transboundary river in southern Africa. And this commission is made up of 3 people from each government, and they help to coordinate and the management. They help to notify and inform the other countries of developments, etc. So the first project that they had there was the Integrated River Basin Management Project, IRBM, that worked closely with OCOCOM from the Okavango River Basin, and helped to establish the Secretariat. And then the follow-on to that program was a Southern African Regional Environmental Program called SAREP, and that's one actually I was on that program in our office in Gaborone, and that worked again with OCOCOM to establish the Secretariat, but to work with them to improve planning and capacities. And then the Resilience in the Limpopo River Basin was doing the similar activities, but in the Limpopo River Basin, and all these projects had the basic same goals, which is conserving biodiversity, ecosystem services, and promoting human welfare. So the Resilient Waters program, it's a new program. I say we're in year 1. Essentially, it combines both of those basins for their focal areas. So you see in the blue are the 2 basins, the Okavango and the Limpopo. And while the previous projects focused primarily on the RBO, the River Basin Organizations, this approach, another way to look at transboundary water management and conservation is through the transfrontier conservation areas. So Peace Parks is an organization that works with all the countries there to manage transboundary conservation areas. And if you look at the ones we have here, you have the Greater Limpopo Transfrontier Conservation Area and the Kavango-Zambezi Transfrontier Conservation Area. The footprints certainly aren't the same as the basins, but there's huge overlaps. And many cases, they were the same people, but they were going through different planning processes, had different plans. So this project tries to take those 2 big processes and see how we can get them to better work together, and also to give some options in working where you're getting most traction. We can work this side or that side. So Resilient Waters, there's 4 basic objectives. The first one is transboundary resource management. That's essentially a governance piece where we are working with the RBOs and the TFCAs. Then we have a piece for WASH, so increased water supply and sanitation. And then there is the climate change piece, so it's actually change and climate. And I think it makes a lot of sense, at first, okay, we look at it as climate change. It's not climate change, it's change, such as climate. Some of that's kind of political, the way we speak about it, but it makes a lot of sense because it is not the only major change that's impacting the ecosystems and communities. When you think about population, the changing economies, how we're looking at land use and the resource base, all of these things are changing. They all interact. And climate, of course, interacts on all of them. And all of those pieces are interacting with the water, people, institutions. So that's just the kind of schematic of where we're trying to work. So one of the things I wanted to look at that would be interesting is the vulnerability assessments, because both programs did climate change vulnerability assessments. They did them in different ways, and Resilient Waters is following up on both of them. So under the Resilum program, they did essentially a very thorough desktop analysis. They did a lot of, I think, downscaled modeling to identify resilience areas. They developed a lot of very detailed maps and a ton of data to go into making these, defining these resilience areas. And then they worked, did a validation workshops, stakeholders to see how that made sense. Okay, so that's an approach. I think it's not an unfamiliar one. I want to mention it because on the SAREP side, we also did a vulnerability assessment. And there was a lot of data, and actually a lot of good primary data on the Okavango. It's a highly researched place, so instead of looking at the downscaling models, there actually was a number of weather stations and information information along the whole basin. And there have been many studies that had been done on it. So what we did was we got someone, a researcher from the CSAG, the Strategic Climate Action Group out of Stellenbosch University, to take all the studies and put together kind of a meta study for us. What are all the different studies, the different models? What are they telling us? Are they telling similar stories? And this is just one of the pieces I pulled out of it. But you can see, yes, there's a lot of disagreement in the magnitudes, but things are trending in the same way. So took that data, put that together, and then took those predictions, which essentially were the same as in the region. Again, increased temperatures, higher variability in rainfall. We also looked at the water flows, which were, again, variable. And and then we brought that to a group of stakeholders to develop the key vulnerabilities. So instead of validating, it was a workshop. Here, okay, here's the prediction. So what do we think? Now, these were scientists and not artists, as you can see, but it was a very hands-on kind of activity. Say, okay, here's the predictions. We've got some of the numbers. These are the ranges. What is this going to mean for you? And we looked at, I think, 5 different livelihood sectors, because this project was also very much focused on communities and on the ground kind of impact. So we're looking at pastoral farming, agricultural farming. We looked at the environment. We looked at tourism, et cetera, and how are these predictions going to impact what the livelihoods in these across the sectors. And then, so we use these documents obviously to help our programming, but they also form the basis for some capacity building that we were working with. We actually worked on these 2 projects overlapped by a couple of years. So in the last few years of SARP, Resilium was active. So we worked together with the 2 programs on a couple of initiatives, especially in Botswana, where they both worked. So we worked with CSAG again to brought in government officials from Botswana to understand better modeling how we take data and turn it into information. We also worked with the meteorological services to develop a vulnerability assessment for the basin. Now, we had our assessment, but the government needs to make their own. And then we also were on the reference group for the government to help them inform and develop their climate change policy. So, okay. So what are we doing on resilient waters? Well, we're building on these assessments, but we're looking at now more the municipalities is a focus. So we're going to look at how we can do those for some of the assessments, for the municipalities, facilitate scenario planning exercises, looking at the climate threats, developing mitigation actions. So looking at urban resilience a little more than the other projects did, I think especially in Limpopo, which is actually a highly urbanized and utilized river system. And then we're looking at financing frameworks, working at, okay, now if we understand the science, how can we help to make our plans have the resources that they need to deal with the challenges from climate change, and then piloting some risk assessment tools, flow models to help planning processes and increase integrated systems-based decision-making. Okay, so these are all now starting to be on progress, all building on the previous efforts. So that's it, and I am out of time. Just wanted to show a regional project like this. We really have a lot of partners. So these are some of them. Thank you for your time. Happy to answer questions at the end of the presentation.
Thanks so much, Brian. Next we're going to hear from Basil Maheni, and he is the Deputy Chief of Party for the Sustainable Water Partnership, and that activity supports USAID's thought leadership, innovation, and programming in global water security. And he's going to talk about SWP's activity in the Mara River Basin in Kenya and Tanzania. So with that, I turn it over to you, Basil.
Thank you, Ali. So as Ali noted, my name is Basil Maheni. I'm the Deputy Chief of Party on the Sustainable Water Partnership. All right, learn how to use multiple hands, I guess. I do want to acknowledge that on the line we have Gordon Mumbo, who is the field team leader for the Mara Basin activity, which I'm going to be talking about specifically within this. And he's going to be available to help answer some of the questions during the Q&A. And the core focus of my presentation is how we can begin to assess and take sound decisions despite risk and uncertainty from climate change. So presentation overview, I'm going to give just a really broad overview of the Sustainable Water Partnership and the water security improvement process. I'm going to give a quick overview of the sustainable water for the Mara activity, and then I'm going to talk about the climate vulnerability assessment process and then how the project has been using the results from those assessments. Very quickly, the Sustainable Water Partnership is led by Winrock International in coordination with a number of other partners. I myself am affiliated with Tetra Tech. So what is water security? For the Sustainable Water Partnership, this is a really important definition. And we define water security as the adaptive capacity to safeguard the availability of, access to, and safe use of an adequate, reliable, and resilient quantity and quality of water for health, livelihoods, and ecosystems and economies. And the reason that we sort of frame it this way, it's really important to broaden the conversation around water security as not just being a function of water resource management, but to take into account socioeconomic considerations, political considerations, and otherwise. And one of the things that the Sustainable Water Partnership really tried to develop and flesh out in the first year of implementation was the water security improvement process. So this is a 5-step process. The first being, defining what is your scope of work. So the geographic and the institutional really identify, some of the stakeholders who need to be involved. The assessment of the water risks, the development of a clear and concise action plan, and something that can be fundable. This is a really key component. Implementation, and then ongoing evaluation. So the idea is that this needs to be sort of an iterative process. And I'm going to be focusing specifically at parts 2 and 3. And you can find more information about this process in the toolkits online. So the Mara activity builds on a memorandum of understanding between the governments of Kenya and Tanzania that was signed in 2005 to strengthen joint management in the transboundary basin. And some of the key activities that we're focusing on in this activity is the development of a basin-wide water allocation plan and decision support tools, exploration and implementation of water security interventions to improve water security, and then institutional strengthening and governance activities. Very broad overview, sort of in terms of the ecosystem in the Mara Basin. It's sort of 3 distinct zones. In the upper part of the basin, this is up in Kenya. This is primarily forest. You have large tea plantations and some small-scale agriculture. Then as you move in towards the border, the mid-elevation rangelands, you find more commercial large-scale farming, small-scale subsistence farming, pastoral communities, and some mining. And this also includes parts of the Masai Mara National Reserve and the Serengeti National Park. And then the lower elevation, the lower elevation wetlands in Tanzania, this is where the Mara River enters into Lake Victoria, and it's primarily wetland, mixed woodland and shrubland, and some agriculture. In terms of demographic characteristics, this is an area that's characterized by high population growth and increased density, high levels of poverty throughout the basin, and an extensive reliance on subsistence agriculture and livestock production, followed by tourism and cash crop production. Okay. So as I noted in the water security improvement process, a key part of this is action planning. And water allocation planning is one tool that we use to help with action planning. And it helps ensure that water is shared among competing and different users and can help ensure coordination, buy-in, and conflict mitigation should there be conflict and emerging from the demand for scarce water resources. And a crucial benefit of the water allocation planning process is fostering a robust decision-making process driven by stakeholders to help address water demand across different types of sectors and users under different scenarios and to inform interventions to improve water security. And to do this, we need good data and we need good information. And this comes from the stakeholders, from water user associations, communities, in addition to scientific data on precipitation, flow rates, and water quality, among others. However, one of the key challenges that we face in this process, especially in the Mara Basin, is one, lack of good data, and then with climate change, the unpredictability going forward. So with climate change, we can no longer rely on historical data to forecast out precipitation patterns, flow rates, and things like that, which are very important, obviously, for agriculture and local economies and the resilience of local communities. So how can the Mara Basin stakeholders take into account the various challenges and the range of risks that are faced within the basin in light of this uncertainty within this planning framework? And I want to note that the Sustainable Water Partnership, and specifically this Mara activity, has been working with Atlas, the USAID Atlas project, and the World Wildlife Fund. They were commissioned to do the climate vulnerability assessments. I'm not going to go into detail on those, except that it was a combination of desk review and data collection and modeling. Chris is in the room if there are specific questions. Otherwise, we can handle those afterwards. But as a part of the climate vulnerability assessment process, we were looking at how do we define vulnerability in these communities? And borrowing from the IPCC's definition, we're looking at exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. And I'm not going to go through and read them, but the 4 questions that we were trying to address are, what are the sectors and livelihoods of the basin that are vulnerable and why? To what climate risks are basin users vulnerable? How will this vulnerability change under a changing climate? And then what resources are available to cope and confront the current risks? And some of the preliminary assessments, and these are sort of general to the basin, these are some of the sources of vulnerability independent of climate change. So similar as Brian noted, climate change compounds a lot of the vulnerabilities that we see in different geographies. So in the Mara Basin, as I noted earlier, you have population growth rate throughout the basin, and this is producing changes in the land use, the way the land is used as forest and grassland is converted for agriculture, for example, livestock grazing, and obviously human settlements. You have persistently high rates of poverty ranging from 20% to more than 45% in various parts of the basin. And because of this, you have fluctuations in food insecurity depending on harvests and agricultural cycles. There continues to be a strong reliance on rain-fed agriculture, in addition to a extensive prevalence on relying on unimproved drinking water sources for drinking, sanitation and hygiene. Excuse me. And then last, you have the issue with insufficient resource planning, management, and enforcement. And these are broader governance challenges, financing challenges, and capacity challenges. So climate risk. These are the 3 climate risks that sort of stood out from the vulnerability assessments. You have increasing temperature and intensity and the duration of heat waves, continued increase in the frequency and intensity of rainfall and drought, and then increased interseasonal rainfall variability. So with that first point, the increasing temperature and intensity and duration of heat waves, this can result in the loss of crops, decreased yields, which obviously has impacts on food security and poverty, negative impacts on livestock production and milk production, declining wildlife populations due to heat stress, which has secondary impacts on biodiversity and tourism, and then also more suitable conditions for vector-borne diseases in new parts of the basin where things like malaria did not previously exist. So to Chris's point about some of the research that they're completing and we'll be presenting on next month. For the second point, the increased frequency and intensity of rainfall and drought events. So one thing that is interesting that stood out from the results of the vulnerability assessment is the overall volume of precipitation is going to stay the same, but the difference is that it's coming in more intense periods. This can lead to flooding and increased erosion. Obviously, can negatively affect crop yields, if not ruin that season's production altogether. It can compound land deterioration and degradation due to deforestation, thus increasing the likelihood of landslides. And then also, on the flip side, droughts leading to increased abstraction of water for agriculture and otherwise. And then for me, what I think is really important is the increased interseasonal rainfall variability. We're seeing are changes in soil temperature and moisture. And this is resulting in a less reliable crop season. And if the farmers don't know when they can plant, this can have secondary effects, you know, within the calendar year on things like maternal health, poverty, and otherwise. So how are we using this really important information? And the first is that they're using the results of the CVA in addition to a number of other tools that we've mobilized to assess options during wet and dry seasons. The climate vulnerability assessments have been really instrumental in the design of various conservation interventions. We're reviewing risks and changes to natural vegetation to understand how land use management, such as forest protection or improved agricultural processes, can improve water supply and quality and minimize the likelihood of erosion. We're assessing alternative livelihood options that don't involve agriculture or possibly also the introduction of more water-efficient crops, and then clarifying how seasonality is going to affect planting conditions and the likelihood of emergent diseases that can affect both communities and the crops. And then with regards to community engagement, raising awareness about drinking water and WASH, raising awareness about the effects of climate change, and then working with organizations like FuseNet for wider dissemination of data, and then assessment of options where we can pilot activities to help improve resilience to extreme weather events within the communities. So in terms of our next steps, in this coming year, we are actually currently working on updating and finalizing the water allocation plans and the WEAP modeling, which I didn't talk about, but is another one of these tools. We're reviewing subcatchment management plans and then working with local stakeholders to strengthen compliance enforcement and resource mobilization. We're working with the stakeholders to educate the public on basin management bylaws and raising awareness about the challenges the basin is experiencing more broadly. And then analyzing catchment rehabilitation options such as protection of springs by planting water-friendly trees along the basin, promoting rainwater harvesting, and then analyzing ways to improve wastewater treatment and recycling efforts by working with major cash crop producers, mining agencies, and hotels. It's sort of, you know, an overall takeaway. I think what is really important and what is really illustrative about this process is through the climate change vulnerability assessment, we're able to pull in and develop more informed decision-making processes. But a key part of that is the stakeholder buy-in. We're working with a variety of different types of stakeholders, from local water user associations to government institutions to regional associations, and all of them play a really important role in making sure that we're able to protect and maintain the viability of the Mara Basin, and also making sure and working with the communities so that they are able to realize more and foster more resilient communities in the context of really sort of unpredictable change. And with that, thank you.
Thanks very much. Next up, we have Jenna Gami, and she's from Forest Trends, and she's the Deputy Chief of Party for the Natural Infrastructure for Water Security activity in Peru, also USAID activity. She specializes in conservation finance, and she's using those tools and that experience to try to increase the recognition of the value of nature and upstream communities in assuring secure, clean water.
Thank you, Ali. Okay. So what I wanted to share with you all today was a bit of the experience that we have and some of the specific types of interventions that we're supporting in Peru. And they're kind of the sexier interventions, the pre-Incan technologies that tend to grab a lot of the headlines. So I wanted to share a little bit of how they work, how we're better understanding how they work, and the types of financing tools that we are working with partners in Peru to scale up to support their broad implementation, as well as other complementary and also important interventions in natural infrastructure for water security. So what I wanted to share was first what we know about how these pre-Incan water harvesting technologies can be cost-effective climate change adaptation strategies in modern Peru, and secondly, how the project that we're working on is working to unlock this potential. So first of all, this builds on what my colleagues have already talked about. We're looking at climate change. So in Peru, water is unevenly distributed in time and space, and so this already causes a significant amount of water stress and challenges, especially in a city like Lima, which is the second largest desert city in the world. But we can see that the increased variability, which is also expected in Peru, maybe not a change in overall precipitation annually, but looking at flashier rainy seasons, more water concentrated in fewer months, as well as increasing demand from growing population centers in cities like Lima. This is a hydrograph of the Rimac watershed, which is what supplies Lima, and so we can see the issue here is not how much water do we have all year long. The issue is that this water that comes in the rainy season is not available to meet demands that exist in the dry season. And in Peru, we also see really importantly that where major population centers are, which tend to be on the coast, as well as major export agriculture tends to be on the coast, it's dry, it's a desert. Whereas we have the Amazon on the inner Atlantic side of the country, which doesn't have such demands from population use or from agriculture. So when we're talking about climate change, adaptation, and resilience in Peru from a water resource management perspective, what we really want to work on is the regulatory capacity of ecosystems, of infrastructure, of our governance to be able to even out these extremes, which already exist in the baseline scenario and are only going to get worse. So now this is an example of one of the technologies that we're looking at, which is it's just a really rich place to work because of this experience. This is called an amuna, or sometimes it's called a mamanteo, in the upper watersheds this is in the Chillón, just one watershed north, and it still supplies Lima. So this is, I'm going to explain how this works. Let's see. So the way that Amuna works is we're looking at this. This is the water's flowing this way. So the river is on this side, and during the wet season, the water is diverted from the stream into the canal. Okay, so it comes into the canal and it starts going across the mountain. Even in the canal, once it's a bit away from the river, it starts to infiltrate. It infiltrates, and then it gets to the end of the canal where it's able to fully infiltrate into an aquifer. And then what we see, and this is different in different cases, but we see that this water actually appears in springs or in other lagoons later on in the a bit downstream. We also have cases where we also assume that part of this water appears in downstream rivers. Some of the work that we've been doing have been tracer studies to figure out how long is this. So you can see this says 1 to 5 months, and we have more precise data now to be able to say how much, and how much of that shows up in 1 month, how much of that shows up in 5 months. Obviously, it's a more impactful strategy if we can get it to 5 months. Where does it show up, and then how is it used? So this is the basic idea. I should also note it's also very much in vogue in Peru, or has been for many decades, to build infiltration trenches with a similar logic, but the confidence around the ability around the contribution in terms of regulatory capacity and considering trade-offs like how it generates sediments is much more uncertain when we're talking about new infiltration trenches rather than the restoration of these pre-Incan technologies, which were developed over, we assume, a period of hundreds of years using kind of trial and error to see where the infiltration would result in recharge of these important springs. And so it demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of the groundwater hydrology in these areas, which we don't yet have today, and we're only starting to recover learning from these systems, which is pretty interesting. Another thing I wanted to point out is that the natural infrastructure part of this helps to support the amunas, or the pre-Incan infiltration canals. So above, for example, where this picture was taken, there are these high Andean grasslands called puna, which in some communities are overgrazed with cattle. And so they're not able to provide really important kind of infiltration and regulatory function that they can play if they're well conserved. Why is it important that it's well conserved when we're talking about the amunas is that if this infiltration takes, or this the percolation from when it's infiltrated until when it appears in the spring or in the streams below is 1 to 5 months, it matters if it enters into the canal in the rainy season at the peak here, or if it enters into this canal. Man, I didn't even touch it. It's very sensitive. How do I do that? How do I get out of here? Just like this? Okay, thank you. It matters if it enters here because the water was able to first infiltrate into the shallow groundwater at the Puna higher altitude level and then travel down the stream until it was diverted. So we're just really starting to understand also how to think about these features of the landscape together as part of a package intervention rather than in kind of a traditional, including kind of a gray infrastructure, gray water resources management way, where we're thinking about kind of specific areas where we have projects and specific points and not necessarily thinking about how they work together. So we're learning a lot. And this is one of the springs that is recharged by one of these canals. So what does this mean at scale? Because we can look at these and sometimes we can think that they are quaint and interesting, but I'm here to tell you that it's more than that. So a few years ago, we had an opportunity to influence the allocation of a tariff for the water utility that supplies Lima to see how much of that budget that would be generated by the tariff could be allocated for green infrastructure. And so we did this analysis where we wanted to know what would be the potential cost effectiveness and the potential impact of green infrastructure interventions in these watersheds that supply Lima. And we included these pre-Incan technologies that work with the aquifers and work in these upstream areas within the package of interventions that we evaluated. And what we found is this graph shows, the height of the bar shows how costly an intervention is per unit of cubic meter of water available in the dry season. And the width of the bar shows the potential impact of scale in terms of cubic meters in the dry season. So, and then they're ordered from most cost-effective to least cost-effective. The most cost-effective interventions are two green interventions. They're the restoration of these pre-Incan canals, which is so cost-effective that you cannot even see it. It's right here, as well as the restoration of wetlands. And then we have the grassland restoration that are available, that are competitive with gray infrastructure and a bit more expensive. And then the gray bars are all different types of gray infrastructure strategies that are available in the watershed, including interbasin transfers, reservoirs, and this very expensive one is the desalination plant. And so what we can see when we look at this analysis is actually the contribution of all the green interventions that we considered in this analysis is not going to replace gray infrastructure. They have to work together, and we need both. But what it could do is reduce our reliance on the desal plant, which could potentially save a fair bit of money as well as reduce energy consumption in this technology. And so now we're looking at how can we actually implement these, because we know that there are a number of systems of these pre-Incan canals that are in disrepair in different parts of these watersheds in Lima and other places in Peru, as well as other interventions that or similarly, there are wetlands, there are forests, there are other natural infrastructure assets in these areas that have been degraded and haven't been properly maintained, and so therefore are not providing the services that are needed to regulate these extremes. And so what we're working on is implementing a national policy framework that is scaling up the potential for payments for ecosystem services across the country. And the basic idea is downstream water users contribute to money to pay for projects and initiatives that work with upstream communities so they can implement certain practices that create benefits in terms of hydrological services like regulating water flows or reducing sediments for downstream users and for themselves. So far, we have 34 water utilities that have allocated payments for ecosystem services tariffs, represent over $30 million only for natural infrastructure. There's another $120 million or so that's also for climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction. And there's a number of others that we're mapping out now from other sectors that are available, like agriculture and from regional governments. However, less than $1 million has been implemented. And why is this? I was talking to somebody earlier today, and I described it as the idea of sort of implementing new technology. If you imagine, like 10 years ago, you're trying to convince somebody that an iPhone would be a great idea. I'm not sure we would want to now. That an iPhone would be a great idea, or you want to convince a big investor that an iPhone or Best Buy or something, that iPhone would be a great idea. And you manage to convince them, even though they're sure that people won't like screens in that way all the time. Well, you could convince them and you could get the commitment to buy the iPhones, but then you still have to you have to build the iPhones. You have to have thousands of iPhones to sell. You've got to have these factories in China, and you've got to have the distribution channels and all of the capacities in the right places. And so that's how I sometimes talk about what we're trying to do. We're trying to build this whole system that can really function at scale that up until this point has been led mostly by small NGOs working on small kind of grant-funded projects. So it's a really different logic, and it has to work within a system that is pretty bureaucratic and that has been set up for great infrastructure. So that's really our challenge. The project I also wanted to mention is a bit unique in the fact that we were able to also count on the contributions of the Canadian government that joined with $12.5 million last year, complementing $50 million from USAID. Forest Trends leads the implementation with our Peruvian and international partners, and we work across sectors in Peru. So we work very closely with the Ministry of Environment, Housing Ministry, Agriculture. We work with Economy and Finance. We work with National Utility Regulator, National Water Authority. I'll just skip this. Yeah, in general, so what we're trying to get to with the project is critical mass of implemented projects so that the how to do it and the pathway to do it is clearly there, and the system and capacities are in place to be able to continue it after the project is done. We're trying to do this in a framework of cross-sector collaboration, integrated water resources management, and that includes figuring out the governance so that something that should take 3 steps doesn't take 23 steps. And then we're expanding the revenue base. So we're working off of right now these policy and financial commitments that have been really pioneered in the water utility sector by some visionary leaders that have been in place in recent years. We're trying to build off of that leadership and momentum to be able to bring in other sectors, other payers from agriculture, from other private sector users to contribute as well. Thank you.
Okay, I want to thank all of our speakers. It was great to hear both how climate assessments and vulnerability assessments can feed into planning activities, water resources management planning, and also to hear a little bit about some ways to adapt on the ground using green infrastructure and free or infrastructure as well. So with that, I think we're going to structure this so that we'll take a few questions, maybe 3 questions, and then we'll put them all to the panel. And I think there's a microphone that you will need to speak into in order for the folks on the phone to hear. So please.
Thank you. Pardon me, Richard Jordan from the Episcopal Diocese of New York's Diocese of Central Tanganyika Task Force with a question for Basil. You mentioned stakeholders. Are you working with faith traditions on the ground, local churches, and the Anglican Communion? Thank you very much.
Thank you for that question. Oh, sorry.
We just take a few more questions too before, and then we'll turn it to the panel.
Right.
I'm Bob Hershey. I'm a consultant. What is being done to try and get some transparency and hold meetings online and get everybody seeing where the money's coming from and what it's being spent for?
One more.
Hi, Ken Andrasco. I'm a consultant to World Bank and other folks. I spent a lot of last year working in Africa, and one of the things that struck me is the challenge of not working inside your little silo, obvious problem. So I'm wondering how you folks in your different programs are approaching the problem that most people are planning for their problem, but not for everyone else's problem that overlaps. So a classic example would be in Africa we have AFR 100, the large land restoration initiative that has these plans. If you look at their maps, they're going to plant all kinds of places which requires water. And so in Rwanda, where I was working in particular, there are lots of issues where people did not take other big plans, big agricultural expansion plans, et cetera, into account. How do you guys deal with that?
Thanks very much. Maybe first we'll address the two questions. Maybe Basil, you can answer those, and then we'll go to the question about making connections.
Yeah, thank you for both questions. I'm actually going to ask Gordon, are you on the line? Okay. Gordon Bumbo is the team lead in the Mara Basin, and oh, interesting. Okay, that's quite accurate. He can, I think, talk a little bit about sort of the different groups, types of stakeholders and involvement of faith groups, if there are any, because I'm not actually aware of their involvement. With regards to the question of siloing, and I'll ask Gordon to sort of chime in on this as well, you know, one of the things that I think is really interesting about the Mara Basin activity is there's a lot of coordination with other implementers and donors who are working in the Mara Basin. And so even when you look at some of the types of the planning for the different types of activities that we're planning for and working on, there is close coordination with other USAID projects. So, you know, Atlas, GIZ, the World Wildlife Fund. And the idea is that we're trying to identify where the synergies are and to be able to ensure that there's cost sharing and maximum impact in the investments that we're making. Gordon, if you're on, I'll ask you to chime in on some of the coordination and collaboration, some of the stakeholders that we're working with.
There is often a delay with the phone, so let's just wait a second. But
Gordon, feel free to jump in if you heard Basil on the line.
All right, for now, maybe can we turn over to some of the other panelists? Do you guys have things to say about the importance of not sort of siloing efforts and making sure that you really treat water and climate vulnerability in an integrated way?
Yeah, sure. On that side, yeah, siloing is a big challenge. One of the things we were working on with SARIP and Reslim was working with the RBOs. When we started working, they were almost all water authorities. The river basin organizations, they were represented by, you know, all the people from the three representatives all working in the water department. Maybe it was water affairs and water utilities, but all water. And we've made a big push to expand that to include environment and in agriculture. And I think that has happened. It's not just us, but I mean, that's the push. We're all working together to get those to be more multi-sectoral. And another thing we were doing is having multi-sectoral dialogues. You know, you get a new plan. We do a management plan, let's say, in the Delta. We were looking, we had to have people from mining, from agriculture, from water, you know, to have everyone there, not just speaking to your group of people. So getting, being sure just the invitations and what you're sharing and sending out, going out across these sectors. And we also looked for those areas where there was intersections. I mean, we showed some Venn diagrams, as always that, but like, for example, looking at human-wildlife conflict, for example, we're looking at the rain, getting less rain, the wildlife is coming more into the human areas and interacting with the people and the agriculture and the environment. So these all come in, where are those spaces that there's very obvious interlinkages, and also trying to focus on them.
Yeah, I would just add one place where we saw this recently, which I thought was interesting, was we were working with the Ministry of Environment to help them set up the monitoring and evaluation system for the nationally determined commitments on climate change adaptation. And they had worked through a process where sector by sector, they had identified what would be the measures that they would implement to support climate change adaptation. And what we found was the different sectors were essentially describing the same type of interventions when it came to the kind of natural infrastructure conservation options, which we were looking at specifically. They were describing very similar areas, and they, in fact, would be working in similar areas or would be interested in recovering similar ecosystems, but they were describing them all in different ways. And so the Ministry of Agriculture, agricultural sector had identified water harvesting as a kind of set of activities that they wanted to do, which could include wetland restoration or something like this. Whereas in other places it was called protective infrastructure that would include reforestation on steep hillsides. And you could look at the different sectors, and if you weren't kind of tuned in to how each of them described these things differently and how it actually looked on the ground, you wouldn't know that they were talking about the same things. And so the Ministry of Environment had said, well, we have each sector has identified all of these different adaptation measures, and we've got to develop tools and guidelines and implementation frameworks for all of them. And we looked at them and we said, no, you don't have to do it differently for each sector. We could do it the same for where there's overlap, and then work with each of the sectors to identify how do they then take the outcomes that they can expect in terms of an ecosystem service or results like improved base flow or reduced sediment, and translate that into what they're interested in terms of expanded potential for irrigation or something like that. So we're trying to work, and I think it helps to get very specific, because in this field we work in big ideas and big problems, and often we end up describing things in rather general terms that can lead to confusion and overlap and duplication of efforts.
Thanks very much. Maybe we'll take a few more questions. Wait for the mic.
See if I can even be louder than Scott Short with Chemonics. My question's for you all. You talked about some changing policy directions with the aid, the increased focus on 3 topics. Where would you say the decreased focus would be?
Sorry about that. I can answer that quickly, I suppose, because then maybe we'll move on to questions for the panelists. I mean, I don't think there's a decrease. I don't think decreased focus on any of the other things. I think it's more that it's a recognition that in order to get to that goal of increasing sustainable access to drinking water and sanitation, along with the other development goals that we work on across the agency, we have to focus more on some of these resource issues, water resources in particular in this case, and then also the sort of bigger governance, water governance and finance questions, which these folks are working on.
Hi, thank you for those excellent presentations. I'm Shira Yaffe. I'm with the U.S. Forest Service International Programs Office. And my question's for Jenna. I would be interested in hearing more. You talked about there's a need for that on-the-ground implementation of projects. And so I'd be interested in hearing more about what you're thinking in terms of how to build capacity for the restoration work, and also for ensuring that the projects are sustainable over time in terms of that monitoring and that adaptive management component.
I think maybe it'll work better for you to take that just right then, and we'll go on to the next question afterwards. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, it's a good question, and we could talk a long time about that. We're taking a few different approaches. So some of the projects, we want to be able to show implementation early on and show good examples. So some of the projects we're working directly with local partners, with water utilities, to be able to develop and demonstrate and be able to really document what it looks like to have, I didn't mention, but we have also a very strong gender equity component. So how do you have a performance-based, sustainable, it recognizes local livelihoods and really integrates the interventions into those and can consider differentiated impacts on women and men and other potentially marginalized groups. How do you, what does that design look like, and how do you monitor over time? So we have kind of specific sites where we're developing those projects and documenting them, but then we have a really robust capacity building program. So we're about to, in a couple of months, launch the first course on public investment in natural infrastructure in Peru that will be hosted by the national university that is in charge of capacity building for public officials. So we'll have regional governments, water utilities, and other actors who are in position to be able to develop projects that their entity can actually finance and implement, doing the course, and the course will have as its product projects that will be finished. And so we'll in that course in the capacity building, we'll actually end up with about kind of 12 projects that will have finance attached to them. So, and then that course will remain in this national school and will continue to be given through kind of online programs as well as in person. So we're looking for opportunities to partner in ways where we can kind of show examples early on and then develop additional examples in ways that really build capacity, distribute in different parts of the country and in institutions where those capacities need to be to develop the next generation of projects. But it's it's an interesting question, and it's tough to balance that sometimes those goals of making sure that however we do it, we need to do it fast, but we also need to make sure that it's done in a way where it's going to be able to be replicated.
More questions from the room?
Thank you. My name, is this okay?
Yeah.
All right. My name is Rita Gerona Adkins, or Gerona Adkins. I'm a journalist. I come from the Philippines, but I write for U.S.-based audiences. I had worked with the United Nations regarding women in development as well as general agricultural development for Asia and the Pacific region. My question, I don't know, I'm probably off base because I came late, but just the same, the last speaker, you're connected with the Forest Trends program. The Philippines, of course, as you know, is 7,000 islands surrounded by water, but the irony of it is that there's a lot of water outside the island, 7,000 of them, but no safe drinking water inland. You know that. Meanwhile, all over, water is cascading from the hills, from the mountains, down to the streets, down to eventually the ocean and the lakes. But inland, population, generally speaking, has to buy bottled water or dirty water that contributes to health, kind of problems. My question is, there is a place called Iligan City where there are a number of waterfalls, and one of them has been developed into precisely a public park where there's swimming pool and entertainment things, and people flock there. Meanwhile, they go back to Iligan City, one of the largest cities in the Philippines, in Mindanao area, and they have bottled water and dirty water to drink, which contributes to health problems and all that. My question is, how do you sort of incentivize, or whatever you call it, the infrastructure that already has started right up on the hills that are earning money, for us and entertainment because it's a social park, and the people down in the city of Iligan, which is just about 40 minutes probably ride by jeep, where there is this paucity of safe drinking water. I don't know what the Philippine government development programs are, and I know that they're very much connected with USAID and all that, and maybe the I don't know, you guys write about and research and stuff like that. I don't know where, but you get the drift as to where I'm leading towards, as to where the international programs such as yours, perhaps the academic sector as well as the development sector, can sort of kind of aim its way to countries like the Philippines and specifically work on projects like this. Thank you.
Thanks for that question. So, I mean, just to summarize, can you guys talk a little bit about how natural infrastructure can be used more widely, maybe to help improve safe drinking water in the places that you're working, including the Philippines?
Yeah, so I would think about that from a couple of points of view. So first of all, I think a tourism operator could potentially be a good payer for, but the first thing we have to understand is why do people not have safe drinking water, right? So is it, what are the challenges? Is it because, yeah, there could be a number of challenges. It's impossible for me to know. But I think what we want to understand first is really what is the challenge, right? And who is that challenge affecting and how? Sometimes when people, if you have kind of peri-urban areas where people are, they don't have access to sanitation, to clean water, but they are purchasing bottled water, maybe that's really a finance issue. Maybe if they could have a small loan or small credit to be able to pay for a toilet or pay for an access to the line, they would be able to resolve that. So sometimes it's kind of looking at those finance issues, and other times it's much more systemic. It's what's going on with the resource. It's maybe there's deforestation, maybe there's other issues that, maybe other problems that are causing contamination or causing a lack of water available when you need it. So you have to really understand the problem and who it affects and how it affects them. And then you can start to build maybe the proposals to convince those who would be affected and maybe willing to work with those who, yeah, it's difficult to say. If there's deforestation or some sort of land use upstream that could be addressed through some kind of mutual benefit proposal, you could develop that. But in a lot of cases, that's not what it is, and you need better regulations, you need better oversight, you need maybe a reservoir treatment plant. So it's really kind of understanding what the problem is and doing that in a collective way, and then trying to figure out, are there mutually beneficial options? Because sometimes those can move a little bit more quickly. One of the things that we would like to do in our project, which I think has this unique ability or opportunity to try to implement natural infrastructure strategies at scale. In a lot of other places, it still is really in the pilot or kind of hypothetical stage, is to be able to capture some of those lessons and then be able to share them in other places where there may be interest in doing that.
I mean, just to sort of add to that, I think one of the interesting things is how, I mean, in Peru, there's obviously a policy framework in place to be able to kind of connect natural infrastructure adaptation measures to payment for ecosystem services to kind of finance that approach. I'm kind of curious in the other cases where you have mapped the vulnerability so well and you have the stakeholders together to try to create plans to address them, you know, whether that natural infrastructure approach is anywhere near ready to kind of get running on the ground, and how you make those links.
So the areas where we're working are generally pretty dry, so it's not the same kind of scenario where you have are able to get the water as a matter of how you distribute it. One of the things we look at is rainwater harvesting, which can be good for especially more remote places, but the rain, you also have to do storage, but for drinking water becomes kind of an issue because we also will need to, if we're going to treat something as drinking water, it has to be treated and or meet certain standards, which is difficult to maintain with a rainwater harvesting system. So we will do those, but often for agriculture or other household uses, but not necessarily for drinking water. For drinking water, most of what we're doing is either boreholes, if it's very remote, or we're working with the water utilities to install either of those boreholes or extend the infrastructure. A lot of times there is water available in some of the cities, but it's a problem to get them out to the communities. It's been out there and it breaks down. So I think Jen was talking about the maintenance, and that's really the key. There's lots of
infrastructure, but it's broken down. So looking at some of the financing models for doing that, some of the stuff we're looking at is working with the water companies, for example, to train some people in the communities to do maintenance, to develop contracts with those between the water companies and the people, so that when it's not worthwhile for the company to send out all the resources to a remote village, they can phone one of the trained people to do some of the maintenance. So the big deal is really ensuring the maintenance, and some of the money, the collection, of course, goes back to the maintenance. So it's not so much the infrastructure is there, but just keeping it operational.
I'm sure this is the case in resilient waters, but one of the interesting things about the Mara Basin activity is you're working in two different countries. And one of the challenges is that you've got discrepancies in capacity, differences in resources. And so how do we begin to even align those systems and those capacities so that when we go through the decision-making and the stakeholder engagement process, that we're actually able to have sort of a clear path forward for identification of potential options. Given that dynamic, the single basin but multiple country, multiple stakeholders, I think one helpful way to think about this is the question of scale. At what scale are we thinking about this? And so obviously, when we think about the use of water, and especially in the Mara Basin, a lot of households are directly abstracting the water for wash purposes. So they're going to the springs and they're going to the surface water. And that obviously has health implications if the water is polluted or is contaminated for whatever reason. Upstream, you find a lot of the cash crop production. So presumably they're using different types of pesticides and fertilizers, and those are flowing in. That has implications for upstream households, but that also has implications for downstream households in Tanzania. And so, you come back to this question of, okay, if we're going to work with multiple different stakeholders across two countries, and they're presenting different, capacities and whatnot, how do we then work with them to bring them through a facilitated engagement process to identify what the right incentives are so that you are, improving the riparian conditions upstream, identifying what the economic benefits are for some of those households, economic and health benefits for the households and for the local economies, for the businesses that are up there, and then being able to translate those into the benefits downstream. And so coming back to this question of siloing, one of the things that we really try to be cognizant of, because to be fair, the Mara Basin activity, it's not a huge multi-million-dollar project. And one of the things I don't think I noted in my presentation is sort of the Sustainable Water Partnership. There are a number of implementation programs, sort of small scale, to sort of test and learn from. And this is a really big part of what the Sustainable Water Partnership does in coordination with USAID, is pulling this information back, finding ways to disseminate this knowledge to sort of broader community of practitioners. So coming back to the case of the Mara Basin is saying, okay, we've got the water user associations in both countries. We've got ministries and regional government institutions. We've got the private sector who are involved, but then you also have the East African community, the Commission. And so recognizing who are the right stakeholders to be involved in at what level, and then building on the incentives to make sure that we're able to address the economic needs, the health needs, the needs of the ecosystem, the needs of wildlife, so that we can, or the communities can be in a better position to offset and respond to any shocks and stressors that might hit the region, whether it's excessive rains one season or, consecutive droughts subsequent.
Thank you. Are there any questions on the line?
So we have not gotten any questions online, but folks that are online, feel free to chime in. Now would be a great time. We have probably about time for one or two more questions. And then I know Gordon is still on the line and had a hard time with his microphone before. So Gordon, I just wanted to give you an opportunity to speak to the Mara Basin activity. Again, if you were able to connect your microphone.
I don't know if I can be heard now. Yes,
Yes,
I think
we can hear you,
Basila's
Gordon. Go ahead.
in terms of coordination, we have a platform where we come together. You know, the Mara Basin forms part of the Lake Victoria Basin, and the Lake Victoria Basin ends up into the bigger Nile Basin. So we have coordinated activities between the Lake Victoria Basin Commission, the Nile Basin Initiative, which is based in Uganda. They also have programs on the Mara, and we work together. In places where we found one organization has a better strength to do an activity, we let them go ahead with it. We also work very closely with WWF, who have been in the Mara Basin for a long time and have a lot of experience. So we coordinate at regional level and also at national level. At national level, we are working very closely with the ministries involved, Minister of Water, Minister of Environment, Minister of Fisheries, Natural Resources, both in Kenya and Tanzania. And we do, in the MOU, as established a Mara Joint Management Committee that brings Kenya and Tanzania together. So we meet regularly also on that platform to discuss issues that are affecting the Mara and who is there. We have the district assemblies in Tanzania and also the devolved government in Kenya, where we have county governments. And the water resources management is a function that is still with the government, but the water services delivery is with the counties. So all these are our stakeholders. At USAID mission level, we really have a monthly meeting in Kenya, which is convened by the Kenya East African Mission. And all the organizations that implement USAID projects come together in this. We share experiences. Unfortunately, the Mara activity is coming at a time when most of the USAID programs in the Mara have ended. But there's very good coordination. The other thing that is also critical to us, especially for the resilient water in South Africa, you are lucky to already have established River Basin Organization. But what we are struggling here is how do we establish a River Basin Commission for the Mara? And the challenge is this Lake Victoria Basin Commission that covers the Mara. There's Nile Basin that also has interest in the Mara. So establishing a River Basin Organization for the Mara is another challenge. And at sub-catchment level, we do have challenges. But we are establishing platforms where neighboring communities along the river can come and talk together on issues that affect them. And that really helps in resolving conflicts. And one decision support tool that Basil mentioned in his presentation is the water allocation plan. Once completed, will give a very good understanding and will help the water managers on how to allocate water for abstraction for agricultural production. And through that, we'll also have an understanding on what is the reserve flow that can sustain environment and basic human life, beyond which the water managers cannot allocate water for any other activity. I think this is all that I wanted to add. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gordon. I did not see any other questions come in online, so I'm not sure if we have maybe one more question in the room. Oh, we have a couple.
Hi, Jenny Kane, USAID. Thank you for all your presentations. Hello. My question is, how often in your project have you encountered challenges from, say, alternate uses of the land that might be, especially when you're looking at payment for ecosystem services, higher paying, and then what sort of intersections are there with, say, tenure, which could perhaps solve some of that if the users are willing to have tenure and are willing to accept the payment versus tenure is insecure and you have threats from ag expansion and that's sort of undermining your ability to maintain water security?
I'll just...
Thank you for the presentation. My name is Jorge Escurra. I work for the World Bank, South Asia Chief Economist Division. And the question is regarding the especially the mechanisms for the environmental payment services. Something that we have been seeing is that sometimes this process sometimes it's difficult to start to disburse for the projects for green infrastructure. And the reason is because, sometimes countries have a deficit with the budget, and they need the gray infrastructure as well. They have big gray infrastructure, and they need money for the maintenance and so on. So something that, based on one of the reports from the IMF that was published, I think that 3 years ago, about valuing water, something that we have seen is that involving also agricultural water. Like, for instance, we know that for agricultural purposes, there is a major consumption of water, and also the payment is low. So try to also see a way how you incorporate agriculture users to this type of mechanisms. I don't know if you did some research, something like that. Thank you.
We'll turn it over to the panel. I think the questions were mostly about ecosystem services and payments for ecosystem services, so maybe we'll start with Jenna, but then if you all have some suggestions about how we overcome the barriers to implementing that kind of adaptation technique, that would be great.
Super. Yeah, so to Jennifer's question. Right, so in a number of cases, you see in the place where the land use change is happening, it's whatever, a forest or a grassland that is providing a number of important hydrological services is replaced by something that in that immediate area is higher value. In a place like Peru, we have the advantage, which is different from countries like Brazil, in that a lot of the expansion, both in the Andean setting and in the Amazonian setting, into grasslands or forests that we want to be able to conserve, is done at a smallholder level and is done to support activities that are not actually that much higher value. And so you have, and the people who are doing it are typically living in poverty. And so, and in the Andean setting, at least, in a lot of cases, it's happening under scenarios where the land tenure is communal, or something that kind of looks like communal. So what we have to be able to do in these cases is to be able to work with the communities to improve land use in other parts of their territory in ways that with some technical assistance and maybe with some capital infusion, we can improve the overall value while maintaining this area as conserved. So that's really what we're trying to work on right now, and I think it also goes to the earlier question about how to make sure that interventions are sustainable. And it's difficult when you're working in trying to work with a water utility and get the people who are used to designing projects to build reservoirs or build treatment plants to now design a project to improve cattle management and develop a land use management plan with a high Andean community, and for them to understand that your investment in this improved species of cattle that's going to generate 10 times more and better quality milk for the community to turn into cheese and sell in their local market is going to be an investment for your water supply. And you can imagine that in a place where the public procurement system is very regimented, being able, kind of working with not only the water utility, but also the Ministry of Economy and Ministry of Environment that's overseeing all this, Ministry of Housing, all these people have to understand microeconomics of a high-end community in order to get on board and let those processes change in the way that they have to, because if you only go up and your intervention is build a fence around the grassland, it's not going to work. So that's one of the things that we're encountering and really trying to work through, and it's an interesting process, and it really it requires the participation of a number of stakeholders. And as far as including agricultural users, definitely the problem is that there's a culture of not valuing water. And there's a culture of providing subsidies to agriculture by not valuing water, rather than providing the subsidy in a different way that is able to maintain a value of the scarcity of the resource and the importance of managing it. And so I think definitely the dream is to be able to get the agricultural users on board. I think what the opportunity that we see in Peru is that through this political leadership, we have money secured from the water utilities that can only be used for natural infrastructure, so we can start implementing there. And our idea, our theory of change is that if we can demonstrate what it looks like and have it be concrete and have places where people can go and visit what does it look like when you exclude cattle here and you have the investment here, and overall this system with the AMUNA's works to generate more water downstream, and we have some monitoring that can create confidence in the system, then we'll be able to start getting more investments from private users like the agricultural sector. But it really also requires this broader cultural shift that they're going to actually value where the water comes from. And we also have to do this in the context where glaciers are melting and there's a surplus of water. There's more water in the system now because of that, so it's even less valued, even though it needs to be at the top of mind because that water is not going to be there in a few years.
I think I'll address sort of both questions at once. One of the things that stood out for me in one of the results of the climate vulnerability assessments with regards to population is, around the world we hear people are leaving rural communities to move into cities, and that wasn't necessarily true in the Mara Basin, and in part because agriculture is a sustainable livelihood. And so given that, there's this question of like, well, if agriculture is such a way to sustain families, and you've got, the small scale holder and the small farmer, then you also have the cash crop production, especially in the northern part of the basin. How do you begin to address those? Because that has really significant implications for land use, which in turn has implications for the basin and specifically the waterways. And so, I was talking to Gordon earlier today about how, there are these explorations of alternative livelihoods, and, alternative livelihoods obviously is not a new concept in development, but why would something like this work in this context, especially if agriculture is such a viable form of participation in the local economy? And one of the things that they noted was, through the dissemination of information and through people sort of being aware of the changes in the land use over time, given the fact that people are in the basin and they're staying in the basin, through the conversation, through the water allocation process, through other types of stakeholder engagement, they're able to pull locally suggested options for what other types of economic engagement would be possible within the basin. And so it's not that, we mobilized these experts and they did this assessment and they came up with these recommendations and, X is, a viable option, and therefore we should recommend this and invest in something. This was something that was coming out of the community and was in essence, ground truth by some of the results in the assessments that were produced. But I think this question of, Jenna's comment, if agriculture continues to be viable and it continues to receive, support, how do you then sort of decouple those to find alternative options? And I think that one of the concerns that you think, and it's really hard to think about these things in broader time frames and scales, but at some point, is there a concern to like a tipping point where then the local economy begins to collapse because the basin has degraded to such a point that agriculture is no longer viable, whether it's because of the extreme weather events or because of the actual the conditions of the land where they're producing.
I'll try to do this quickly. One of the interesting things about a regional program is scale, right? You're working at hugely different scales at the same time. So thinking about trade-offs, at our largest scale, looking at, say, the Okavango, okay, we've got a very high value tourism business, at the end of the river, right? But upstream, it's a very low-value agriculture. So on the one hand, the economics work out great. When it's very valuable downstream, only small payments can get a big impact and moving that upstream. However, in case of transboundary, you're convincing Botswana to transfer benefits to Angola. That is extremely difficult. To put a other spin on it, however, when you're working on two basins, Botswana also is upstream of Mozambique, and now there's some very low-value upstream Mozambique cattle that are impacting downstream municipal areas in Mozambique. So it can help you bring people to the table, I think, looking at, even though it's hard to transfer benefits, and we haven't done it successfully. It's an ongoing process, but just knowing that with all the rivers and transboundaries, you're upstream one case, you may be downstream in another. When we're looking at the Delta, updating the management plan for the Okavango Delta to be a World Heritage Site, we brought in people from the mining sector, and they said, well, we don't care what you say. We're doing some mining here. I mean, this is our country, Botswana, makes its money from mining, and we're going to do mining. Okay, so how do you deal with those trade-offs? I mean, that's the ultimate, like, huge high value. What we did in that case, working with getting the environment people and the mining people, okay, look, there were some buffer zones from the Delta that we were not able to include in the World Heritage Site, but there were some other areas that that weren't in the protected area, but that had mining licenses that the mining Department of Mines agreed to not issue further permits. So we did some trade-offs in the, and those are some of the things you need to do. And then at a very community level, we did something, it was a process called LUCIS, a Land Use Conflict Information System. Essentially looking at competing land uses, whether, agriculture, it's pastoral, it's tourism, and then environment. We looked at what are the optimal uses for each one of these, put those in a layer, and when there's multiple layers with the same areas that are optimal, okay, that's where you have your conflicts. And sometimes that's, it's getting information, especially to the community, to make that decision. What is it that they actually value? And sometimes it's just providing information where everyone thinks, okay, right here along the river, that's where everyone wants to be. Duh, okay, that's where, how do you solve that? But for agriculture and not environment, the road is extremely important, and so are soils. And we're able to really looking at it to identify, actually, there are some better agricultural areas away from here, leaving paths for elephants. So I guess I'd say just on that side, it's information and to make better decisions and to bringing in multiple people kind of into the process. So.
Okay, I think with that, we'll close or end our session here, but I want to thank you all for coming and thanks for hosting us. To further discussion, you can see the contact information up there, but I'll hand it over to Becca.
Thank you. If we could all just give a round of applause to our great panel. Thank you all for coming out here. I know we're a couple minutes over, but I did just want to mention I saw a couple folks taking photos of the PowerPoint. This will be posted on Climate Links next week, so you will have access to the full PowerPoint deck as well as a full recording of today's session as well if you want to review anything or share it with colleagues as well. And as Chris mentioned at the beginning, next month's Adaptation Community Meeting will look at, the links between malaria and climate risk. So I hope some of you can join us. That's on May 16th, and we'll be hearing from Sadie Ryan, who's an associate professor from the University of Florida, who's been working with Atlas on this work. So stay tuned and look